they had them stand before the sermon because it would be the last time they'd be on their feet for a couple hours. So there are variations on the history of why they stood for that song before the sermon. It's good to see all of you tonight. Appreciate you being here. A couple weeks ago, and maybe I should have done a better job of ordering that so they'd be a little closer together. But a couple weeks ago on Sunday night, I talked to us about that adversity and the realities of life sometimes that set in and the challenges those present and the difficulties that we have sometimes to kind of fight through some very, very challenging and realistic issues. We examined the life of David and we illustrated how one problem after another, some of them his fault, some of them not his fault. Some of them, there was some responsibility that he had for what had occurred and what was going on. In other moments, you find David really just fighting through the difficulties that others were creating for him. And I can imagine it would be hard for David to ever think that he had a right or would even be able to ever think that there'd be another happy day in his life. That through all the tumult and challenge and hardship, could he ever experience a moment of joy again in light of all those difficulties that he experienced? I want you to run back into Psalm 51. I'm going to flip you back and forth for a moment here. I want to look at Psalm 51 in verse 12, then run to James 4, then come back to Psalm 51. Just want to bounce you for just a second. Because there's a statement that's made in Psalm 51 and verse 12. Psalm 51 and in verse 12. When David here recognizes the challenges that he'd experienced, the difficulties. If you go back at the beginning of this psalm, you'll probably notice that a lot of the translations and versions that have there at the beginning of that, this is a psalm of David right after Nathan comes and tells him, you're responsible for the sins as relating to Bathsheba and the difficulties surrounding it. And so David writes this psalm, and in verse 12 of it, he says, restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me by your generous spirit. I can imagine that after the kinds of sinful conduct that David had experienced and the things that David and the problems that David had created for himself, I suppose it would have been possible for David just to conclude that he didn't have any right to joy from that point forward. That after he's taken another man's wife and he's lured her in and the invitation has been extended and she comes to him and all of those sinful results that come from that circumstance, you might think that David would conclude that he doesn't have any right to joy. And yet he asks the Father, restore my joy. Particularly, restore my joy in your salvation. Restore my joy recognizing that you are the one that led me up. I appreciate the Psalms that David led prior to this sermon because they're exactly in tune with the thought processes we want to express tonight. David recognized that though he may not in some ways have a right to joy, he still wants to experience it and realizes that God the Father is the one who can provide it. We all know the need to have our joy restored. Who hasn't hit the depths of lows and felt like, will I ever smile again? Will I ever find happiness again? Will I ever be able to experience the kind of joy that I once experienced in this life? And maybe the hardships of life have tried to tell us and tried to convince us that because of those difficulties, I shouldn't even expect any joy or happiness in my life ever again. I want you to notice just a couple of passages. Now go to James chapter 4. And let's look at this text that Scott read for us just a moment ago. And I want you to see a few thoughts within this narrative with me. In James chapter 4, verse 8, he says, draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. I want you to notice something. His commendation in this verse is to whom? His commendation in this verse is to sinners. He didn't say, all you people that are so good, God loves you because you're so adorable. He said, all you who are sinners, all you double-minded folks, all of you who have impure things on your hands, all of you who have had challenges, cleanse your lives and draw near to God. God is not going to distance Himself from you in such a way that He is unreachable. God is not unreachable to anybody. It doesn't matter what you have done, what you have said, what you have encountered in your life. The sinner needs to recognize that joy can be restored. That's what David's driving at in Psalm 51. I have committed horrible sins against God and others for that matter. I have committed horrible things that really ought to face the indignation of God and the condemnation of God. But restore my joy. The sinner needs to recognize that he does not have to remain in the disappointment and sorrow of sin, but he can come to his Father, his Creator, and appreciate the benefits that come. Now notice verse 9. Lament and mourn and weep. That's the initial and proper response to sin. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Now you say, preacher, that seems counterproductive to the lesson title and the things you're talking about tonight. That text seems to imply that I shouldn't be thinking about happiness and joy, but I should be thinking about gloom and despair and challenge. No. He says that's what you should think in relationship to sin, not about your God. You lament, you mourn, you sorrow. Don't laugh at the sinful impurifications of verse 8. Don't scoff at the idea that I'm a sinner and try to act as though those aren't the things that are causing the challenge. He says, be mournful over those. Weep over those sins. But notice then verse 10. Don't stop reading. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. You know what one of the great challenges that we have is we try to find joy and happiness in this life without the Creator. And it will always be impure. It will always miss the mark. It will never be satisfied. The world can't satisfy the joy that I'm seeking. The world can't provide for me a joy that is continual. The world cannot offer unto me the ability to maintain a level of happiness in my life despite all the realities that might be there. The sinner needs to recognize the impurifications, turn and lament over those things, humble ourselves, and then let God lift me up. Will you let God lift you out of sin and condemnation? Will you let God lift you out of the despair and the lamenting and the world without laughter because of sin, and restore the joy that He would desire for all of us? The servant who becomes weary needs the joy that comes from God. The servant who is convinced that joy is too elusive for him needs to recognize that God wants us to experience the benefits of His joy. Notice verse 9 of Galatians 6. I'm sure you've seen this text before. But he says, and let us not grow weary while doing good or in well-doing. For in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. We get tired sometimes. We become weary of the process. We become wearied by the process. As we try to resolve challenge after challenge, as we try to find answer to the difficulties that we experience in everyday life, and we wonder, is there ever an end to this? And sometimes because we can't ever see any light at the end of the tunnel, because we never really are able to see any kind of end result from all of these challenges, we determine that happiness and joy will always elude me. And He says, be careful, servant. Be careful. Don't become weary in the process, because God's joy can be there for you not only through the process, but at the end of the process as well. The sinner who has rejected God needs to experience the joy of God again. The wearied servant needs to experience the joy of God again. All of these folks and others need to appreciate that joy can be restored, just as David asked for in Psalm 51. Now let's go back to that text and look at it for a moment. If joy and happiness are what I'm seeking, then it might be well for me to examine potentially why it is I'm not experiencing it in the moment. And recognizing that at times sin is robbing me of the joy that God is saying is available if we'll but reach out to it. Notice verses 1 through 3 of the psalm. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is always or ever before me. You should think about David's thoughts there. Before he ever asks for restoration in verse 12, the very thing he says is, I'm responsible for this. I am accountable to the problems that I am experiencing because of my choices and the sins that I have committed. And so he recognizes the first step in this process is to acknowledge the sin, implore God to help him get out of that sinful behavior, to cleanse him and renew him, and to let him walk in righteousness. Blot out my transgressions through your tender mercies, he says in verse 1. Wash me thoroughly from my lawlessness or my iniquity in verse 2. Cleanse me from my sin. Sin will rob us of joy and happiness, guaranteed. And the problem is we don't want to admit that. You see, David thought that happiness would come by inviting another man's wife into his house. David thought joy and happiness would come if he could reach out to this one that he sees bathing up while gazing on. David assumed that would bring him joy, that he would find happiness if he could make some kind of connection with Bathsheba. And when he experiences that, he realizes that was not the path that would lead to genuine happiness. Fill in the blank, by the way. That's the example of David, but just fill in the blank with any kind of sinful pursuit that you and I seek after. And the same result will occur. What we think is going to bring joy, what we think is going to make me happy, what I think is going to bring me all the just wonderful feelings that I'm looking for will not come through sin. It never has, it never will. It is only pleasurable in the moment and always brings further and future consequence. Because its wages is death, right? We learned that this morning. And so David recognizes if I have any hope of restoration to my joy, if I have any hope of happiness returning, I've got to address this sin and its issues. I need the cleansing power of God. I need to be restored to Him. I need to purify myself. I've got to walk away from these sinful behaviors. The first step for us, if sin is robbing us of joy, and we first have to admit that that's really the problem. And then we have to have the courage, the fortitude, and the determination to leave those behaviors so that God's restoration can come and His happiness can come. And then notice verse 4. Against you, you only. Now let me ask you something. Is that true? You've seen this psalm before, I'm sure. He says, against you and you only have I sinned. Is there other people? Well, wouldn't Uriah be kind of involved in this too? Hadn't he kind of wronged him by taking his wife? Oh, yeah, sure. Wasn't Bathsheba in some ways? Aren't there other people that are facing consequences and have challenges because of David's behavior? The answer is yes. That's not the heart of David in the moment. The heart of David in the moment is a recognition that his first and foremost priority and problem is that his actions alienated him from his Creator. I have sinned against you. And so this expression, I have sinned against you and you only. You are the priority here. I've done this evil in your sight. This wasn't just about two people behaving badly. This was a transgression against the Father, the Creator of all things. That you may be found just when you speak and blameless when you judge. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. Behold, you desire truth in the inward parts, and the hidden part you will make me to know wisdom. David's somewhat picturesque language here. Recognizing, I think we can see that and note that in this poetic writing, when he begins by saying this idea of that he's only sinned against God. That's the frame of mind that's framing everything else he's saying. And so when he says, from the time I was born, that's the depths of how David felt about his sinful behavior. It is as if from the time he was born, he's just been in iniquity and lawlessness and sin. That's how overwhelming it is to him as he writes these things. And though that may not be true in reality, it may not be true in reality that God's the only one he sinned against, because there were others that he wronged in this. Though it may not be the reality that he actually was a sinner from the moment he was brought forth and conceived. David is expressing how deeply he feels about these sins and the challenges they have brought. He is writing to help us and help anyone who would read. And it's all interesting to me to think about how you would sing this. But it is a song. But yet he expresses this overwhelming sense. And you and I, at times, may feel overwhelmed by our actions and the things that are around us. We may feel overwhelmed by the challenges they present. And yet it moves us, hopefully, to recognize that the only true answer is Jehovah in all this. David recognizes the only hope he has in all of this. His only hope to remove the despair and to remove all the difficulty and this deep sorrow that he's experienced because of his actions is Jehovah. He's the only hope. Notice in verse 7, purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me hear joy and gladness, that the bones you have broken may rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Purify me. Heal me. David was broken, and in his picture that he's drawing here, he says, the bones you have broken. Now, did God purposely injure David? Did God purposely pick David out and say, I'm going to harm him some way? No. God established law. God established what was right and what was good. And when David breached the law of God, he became a broken man. But the very one who establishes the law, the very one who establishes what is right and good, is able to also come back and say, I will heal you. Yes, my law will point to you and recognize, here are the things that you have transgressed. Here are the mistakes you have made. Here are the sinful conducts that you've been engaged in. And it will break us down. But God can provide healing so that I can hear joy and gladness again. So long as I stay in the sinful behaviors, so long as I stay alienated from God, so long as I stay in challenged relationship with the Father, I won't be able to hear the joy He's trying to extend to me. I won't be able to know the benefits of gladness until I approach God for the healing strength that He provides. In verse 10, create in me a clean heart. You ever played any golf? Some of you have, I know. I've hit a white ball with a stick around a grassy knoll a time or two. And in golf, sometimes when you play with fellas, they give you what they call a mulligan, a redo. Generally speaking, that's off the tee box once around. I played with a fellow that thought he could take it from the fairway or wherever he wanted to take his mulligan from. But you know preachers, they'll make up the rules as they go anyway. Redo, though. A do-over. You know, God does that for us really on some ways on a daily basis. He lets me get up every day and say to Him, Lord, purge me with hyssop. Clean me. Cleanse my heart. Renew me again. Allow me to start this day better than I started the day before. Give me the courage to honor You greater in greater ways today than I have ever done in the past. Redo. Time for a restart. And so we're going to appeal to God's righteousness. We're going to appeal to His presence. We're going to ask Him to let us start anew. Create in me a clean heart. Give me a restart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Lord, give me the courage to be renewed, not just for the moment, but renew in me a steadfast spirit. Commit yourself to it. I am convinced that a lot of folks miss out on the joy and gladness and happiness of being a child of God because they don't commit to it. They stab at it. They make attempts at it. But if you want the real joy that comes from the Father, if you want to know what happiness is really like as a child of God, commit to it. It's the only way to experience it in its fullness. And to begin to experience it that we might push forward in it. Do not cast me away from your presence. And do not take your Holy Spirit from me. One of the loneliest places, I suppose, that any human being could get is to convince themselves that they are so far away from God that He is unreachable. Happiness will elude us if we've convinced ourselves that God is unreachable. He is never unreachable. And even though David's sins are tremendous and the sorrow that's related to it is tremendous, he's imploring God, bring your presence back to me. Let me know you are here for me. Let me notice and know and experience your presence in my life. Appeal to the Father for His presence. Restore to me the joy, verse 12, of your salvation, and uphold me by your generous Spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners shall be converted to you. I think sometimes we need to start affirming God's greatness personally and publicly. Notice he said in verse 12, restore to me the joy of your salvation and uphold me by your generous Spirit. The first stage is David's got to get himself back to normal. He's got to get himself back in the joys of God. He's got to restore himself back into right relationship with God. Once accomplishing that, then he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and encourage others to do the same. I'm going to go talk to others about how it is that when I left sin, God renewed my joy and encouraged me again. When I quit being a transgressor and started living the clean-hearted life that God can create in me, great things started to happen. The longer I remained in sin, the more challenges come, the less joy I experienced in life. Restore that to me, God, and I will go tell others about your greatness. I'm concerned that sometimes we don't have the effect on our families, our communities, our friends, our neighbors, the people we work with, because they don't see the joy of the Lord in us. They see the same mumbling, complaining, grumbling, challenged people that already are in the world. What kind of image are we giving? What kind of encouragement would it be to somebody else to say to them, you need to come to the Lord so that you can be just like me? And then they say, well, you complain every day, you gripe every day, you're sad every day, you're miserable every day. Why would I want to do that, right? David says, restore my joy, restore my gladness, I'll help others do the same. I'll experience it personally, then I'll go help others do the same. Friends, we have got to do a better job letting our world know that there is no greater happiness, no greater joy, no better way to experience life on this earth than as a child of God. There is nothing better than it. And we've got to demonstrate that and draw that picture for folks. We sing that song, we are the world's Bible, right? God has no hands but our hands. He has no feet but our feet. When we sing about the idea that the world in many senses is depending on our efforts to influence and to guide and encourage them to come to the Father. And what greater way in a world that seems to be awful dark sometimes, in a world that seems to be awful connected to anything and everything, if it's negative, the world attaches itself to it. And yet people are clamoring for something good and positive, be that. Be that for them. Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, verse 14, O God. The God of my salvation, and my tongue shall sing aloud of your righteousness. Make your joy so obvious that people will ask you, why are you so happy all the time? You know, which question would they be more likely to ask me, right? Would people be more apt to ask me, why are you so happy all the time, or why are you so sad all the time? Now, I recognize there are going to be moments of heartache, sadness, despair, challenge. There are going to be those moments in our lives. But which one is illustrative on a regular basis? Which one is expressed on a regular basis from my life? O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall show forth your praise. For you do not desire sacrifice, or else I would give it. You do not delight in burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. These, O God, you will not despise. Do good in your good pleasure to Zion. Build the walls of Jerusalem. Then you shall be pleased with the sacrifices of righteousness, with burnt offering and whole burnt offering. Then they shall offer bulls on your altar. David recognizes that humility will lead him to the joy that he's being robbed of because of sin. And so when weariness is like a thief, consider the work of God. When weariness is winning the day and I don't seem to find the joy that I'm seeking, then recognize the grace of God that comes forth. Recognize the cleansing power of Jehovah that we've already examined in our study tonight. Recognize God's encouragement and healing that comes to any and all who would approach Him. Experience what it is like to be encouraged by the fact that I asked God to help me and He did. I asked God to encourage me and He did. And sometimes what I need to do is begin to open my eyes and recognize what God has done. You've heard the story about the fella in a flood. And somebody walks by his home and says, you need to leave. Waters are coming up. He says, no, I'm okay. The Lord will take care of me. A little while later, a guy in a boat comes by and says, you need to get in the boat. The water's coming up. The guy says, no, the Lord will take care of me. Climbs the top of his house. A helicopter comes. No, I'm not leaving. The Lord will take care of me. And then he gets swept away, right? And his question to God is, why didn't you take care of me? And God says, what? I sent a person by your house to tell you to leave. I sent a boat and I sent a helicopter. Right? Sometimes the things that God is doing for us, we blind ourselves to. We say, when has God ever helped me find joy? When has God ever tried to bring happiness to me? When is God? And it may be all around me. God may have already sent people in a boat, a helicopter. Choose one. Choose one. God may be doing all kinds of things for us. And He's doing all that He can to restore my joy and to encourage me and to bring healing to me and to lead me and to help me. And maybe part of this process is for me to admit that it's okay. Maybe I don't think I'm worthy of the boat or the helicopter. Maybe I don't think that I'm worthy of ever experiencing the happiness and joy. Friends, if there was ever a person who wasn't worthy, David would fit the description. If there was ever somebody who wasn't worthy to ever experience joy again, it would certainly be a man who took another man's wife, tried to cover it up, and tried to cover it up in such a way that he sends that woman's husband out into the battle to be killed. If there was ever a man who didn't deserve to be happy again, it would be David. And yet he's imploring the Lord, restore to me my joy. God's encouragement and healing can come, but I have to acknowledge that it's okay for me to embrace it. It's okay for me to experience that. No matter what realities and no matter what adversities and no matter what challenges I have experienced, if David can look to the joy of the Lord and humble himself and to receive it, then so can I. Yes, I'm personally guilty. And yes, there are times where I've transgressed the law, just like David had done. But He can deliver me. And I can petition God the Father for a renewed spirit. Father, refresh me. Give me that steadfast spirit. When weariness is trying to rob me of joy and happiness, give me that steadfast spirit that we read about in verse 10. Give me a new commitment towards You. Give me a heart that is dedicated to You again. And give me, according to verse 12, a willing spirit. A willingness to allow You to cleanse my heart, renew me again, that I might experience joy and happiness that God would want all of us to experience. And friends, let me conclude tonight back in the psalm by recognizing that when we align our desires with God's, the happiness will return. Notice verse 6. Behold, You desire truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part You will make me to know wisdom. Align your desires. Align your desires with truth. Align your hopes and dreams and your life in alignment with God's will, and good will come. Verse 17. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. These, O God, You will not despise. A man who humbles himself. A man who will recognize and lower himself in the eyes of God. God will not forget or lose sight of. Verse 18, do good in Your good pleasure to Zion. Build the walls of Jerusalem. Let me be to the good pleasure of God. And let the joy and the happiness that comes being a follower of Jesus Christ benefit me all the days of my life. Friends, I know that there's not a soul sitting in this room tonight who has not experienced their fair share, or maybe they're more than fair share of heartache and challenge. And you may struggle at times trying to decide, does God have me in mind when He says I can have a renewed spirit? Does God have me in mind when He said I can restore the joy of salvation? Does God have me in mind? As David wrote, that the joy and happiness of God might return to him. And the answer to that, in simplistic terms, is yes. God has you in mind. He's got me in mind. He has all of us in mind. If you'll come to Him, be humble, be contrite, open yourself up to that which God is extending. Appreciate what He is offering. And that doesn't mean that the hardships will be erased as if they never happened. It doesn't mean that we'll be able to just kind of forget all things that were ever hurtful or hard for me to have to address in life. But what it means is God will give me a renewed heart and a renewed spirit. And I'll be able to experience joy and happiness, not because life is great, but because God is great. And I'll be able to experience and know what real joy is. Not because the pleasures of the world have returned to me, but the good pleasure of God. As He could rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, He can rebuild the walls around my life and restore me new again. If you're outside of Christ tonight, you need to experience the remission of sins that comes through the blood of the Lamb. Will you die with Christ in baptism tonight? Will you cleanse your life of all that is sinful and walk anew with your Savior? Maybe you've done that. And it's time to humble ourselves and say, I need to walk anew with my Creator. If we could help you tonight, pray for you, strengthen you, encourage you in some way, we'd invite you to think soberly about your relationship with Christ. Won't you come while we stand and while we sing?